All right, everyone. So I want to talk to you guys about the war over Ukraine's south and how it's really not looking good for Ukrainian troops. The New York Times put out an article today talking about this, and it talks about how Ukrainian troops are having to go through devastating battles with very high casualties. And the article says, and I'll read to you guys an excerpt from it, and I'll put a link to the article in the description below. The article says the South remains a different story from the Northeast. Interviews with dozens of commanders, ordinary soldiers, medics, village leaders, and civilians who recently escaped the conflict zone portray a more difficult and costly campaign. The fighting is grinding, grueling, and steep in casualties, perhaps the most heartbreaking battle in Ukraine right now. So this is quite different from the impression that we were getting not too long ago about Ukrainians defeating Russian soldiers and Russian soldiers running for their lives and Ukraine just valorously advancing. Now, Ukrainian troops did advance in the northeast, but they're having to fight the Russians in the south. And as I said in my last video regarding this war, um, while the Ukrainians did take thousands of square kilometers from the Russians, uh, the Ukrainians are now having to fight the Russians on two fronts, in the northeast and in the south. And this is proving, obviously, quite challenging to Ukrainian soldiers. So this article really gives us a more realistic and graphic image of what is occurring. And it says here that the Ukrainian government does not usually disclose casualty figures for obvious reasons. They don't want to give off the impression to NATO that they are losing because the Ukrainians want NATO to have enough confidence in Ukraine that they will continue to send advanced weaponry to Ukrainian troops. The article goes on to say, but the soldiers and commanders interviewed in the past week portrayed the battlefield losses as high and massive. They described large offensives in which columns of Ukrainian tanks and armored vehicles tried to cross open fields only to be pounded mercilessly by Russian artillery and blown up by Russian mines. One Ukrainian soldier, speaking anonymously because he was not authorized to publicly discuss casualties, said that during a recent assault, quote, we lost 50 guys in 2 hours. The same soldier also talked about how hundreds of Ukrainian troops were killed or wounded while trying to take a single village. I don't think this type of carnage took place in Iraq. I think the closest thing to this that you can find in the Iraq War was Fallujah, and only about 26 Americans died in that battle. Now, that's 26 too many, but this is a huge difference from what is happening in Ukraine. And the article goes on to talk about how the Russians have relocated more better trained soldiers to the south because the Ukrainians put up this huge propaganda campaign talking about how they are winning in Ukraine's northeast. And the Russians basically said, okay, so you're telling people that you're beating us in the northeast, so we don't want you to take more territory in the south, so we're going to relocate better trained soldiers from the northeast to the south. We're going to redeploy more tanks to the south so that we can prevent you from taking significant territory in that part of the country. So now the Ukrainians are having to fight the Russians on two different fronts, and they're having to face vicious Russian attacks and defenses in the south. And the article talks about how there is a woman in Ukraine who is a medic, and she talks about how she rarely ever has to deal with a soldier suffering from bullet wounds because so many Ukrainian soldiers are literally being blown to pieces. They're not even being shot. They're just being blown up into pieces, like in the scene from Saving Private Ryan. when they're trying to take the beach. So it's like, oh, you barely ever have to deal with a soldier with a bullet wound. That means the Ukrainians really must be winning. No, no, no. They're just getting blown up to pieces. This is a huge difference, a huge stark difference from the impression that we were getting days ago about how Ukrainians are just taking huge amounts of territory and the Russians are running away for their lives. This is why I say people don't have knee-jerk reactions to things. Yes, the Ukrainians took thousands of square kilometers in the northeast and they took a bunch of territory in the south, but this does not mean that the Russians are losing, and this does not mean that the Ukrainians are going to win this. This is going to be a long war. I mean, that's the impression that I'm getting at least right now. And it's very, very difficult for the Ukrainians, and that really goes without saying. And this really gives us a good idea of what it's like to fight in a European context, because over the decades we've been so used to hearing about fighting in the Middle East, right? Ramadi and Fallujah, but the even in the Battle of Fallujah, which is seen as one of the worst devastating battles that the Americans had to go through in Iraq, even in Fallujah, the casualties was nothing like what we're seeing in Ukraine. Just fighting over a single village, 100 Ukrainian soldiers are either killed or wounded, and in 2 hours, 50 Ukrainian soldiers get annihilated. That sort of thing didn't happen in Iraq. So all these years we've been talking about fighting the Muslims and all this, but this is why I've been telling people about a war in Europe, because this is a war on the edge of Europe. And I believe that there's going to be a war in the heart of Europe. I foresee a war that's going to devastate all of Europe, or at least most of Europe. I see Germany reviving as a military power. I see a devastating conflict erupting in the middle of Europe. And if people thought that Iraq was bad, wait until you see a full-scale conflict in the European continent. And this really goes to show you that when Europeans fight each other, the casualties are absolutely devastating. Iraq is nothing in comparison to this. And in the future, we're going to be seeing a war in Europe. And yeah, Americans lost their enthusiasm for war when the Iraq War was taking place. Americans just lost their will, their enthusiasm, because so many Americans were being killed by IEDs, and Americans were being sniped, and they were being killed by terrorists, insurgents. America is right now transitioning into a phase of isolationism. So if a war were to break out in the heart of Europe, Americans are not going to get involved. If Iraq was enough to ruin the morale of the United States, a war in Europe is not going to interest the United States at all. And this is why I think America is slowly giving the green light to the Germans to revive their military power, because the Americans are not interested in being the world's police state. So looking at this war at the edge of Europe, imagine how devastating a war would be at the heart of Europe. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.